Hello, welcome back to the Book Corner. I am Dave, and today we're going to be talking about Dune! Frank Herbert's Dune. Now, it was obviously high time I read this because I like reading science fiction novels, and this is a very significant one and I hadn't read it yet. It had been sitting on my dad's bookshelf for presumably my whole life, but rather than wait until I could next go and visit them and dig it out from their house, I thought I'd just go and get my own. And hence, here's mine, I bought the paperback. So I came to Dune the way I think a lot of people my age do. Slightly excited, slightly reluctant. It's the Lord of the Rings of sci-fi, and you know what that means. It'll probably be full of lots of memorable and iconic things, but a bit of a slog to actually read. I'd seen the film some years ago and not understood a single thing that was going on in it, so none of it had actually managed to lodge itself in my mind because of this, so I essentially went in blind. I mean, I knew about the worms, but that was about it. First of all, can I say, who the hell decided on this cover? Dune has inspired so many beautiful illustrations, there's so many iconic sort of images in it that can be illustrated, and instead, for what appears to be the current most generally available paperback edition, they went for a generic explosion in space? What's that even got to do with it? I'm trying to think back now, is there even an explosion in space in Dune? I don't know, is there? I don't know. So, to get generally down to it, I shouldn't like this book. I shouldn't like it because, as it turns out, it does a lot of the things I don't enjoy books doing. But despite them all, I did enjoy it. And although I'm not crazy about it, like so many people are, I did find it compelling. I must have done to get through such a long book in such a relatively short amount of time. Look at the size of the text on there, that is a lot of text to be getting through. So I want to talk about this by bringing up the reasons I was conflicted, the reasons that will usually make me dislike a book. And for each one, I'll try and figure out why I like this book despite it. Firstly, the language. Whoa, Dave, wait a moment. Wait a jolly moment, you lot. If there's one thing that's definitely good about Dune, it's the language. That's true, that's very true, but remember what I'm doing here, remember the format. I'm telling you things that in other books usually wind me up, and then I'm telling you why it was good in Dune. Science fiction books are often set either in the far, far future, or on some other alien world or something like that. So let's say you're a science fiction writer and you're setting out to write a book in which you know that the language that the people in the book speak is different to the one that your readers, let's say English-speaking readers, are going to be able to understand. So you're going to write the book in English, say, but it needs to authentically feel like it comes from this other culture with their own language. How do you tackle that in the writing? There's a couple of options. One is to treat the book like it's been perfectly translated from the original alien language, write it in a conversational, relaxed form of English like I'm talking to you now. But there's a problem with that because relaxed English has a lot of slang in it, and slang has regional origins on Earth. What is the alien equivalent of a Cockney, for instance? Maybe you accept that and say, okay, well, the original dialogue spoken in this foreign language was conversational originally, so it's been translated into conversational English. But if that bugs you, then there's always the other option, which a lot of writers take, too often if you ask me, and that is to write the book in a kind of lofty version of English. Nothing relaxed, and the corners of the personality of the writing smoothed off as much as possible. And just to remind you that this is an alien language, and the writer has figured this language out, you guys, they'll sprinkle some alien-sounding words on the top of the dialogue. Now, this is the way a lot of science fiction and fantasy books are written, and I'm tempted to say it's kind of the default option. But if not handled carefully, it can come across as pompous, and that usually puts me off, as you might remember me mentioning in my Discworld videos recently. But how does this relate to Dune? Well, Dune is one of those books that wants to sound like the most important book. It wants to be read in a stately baritone. Because of the setting of this particular book, it's possible, and I actually genuinely don't know whether this is true or not, that the people in it are actually speaking English as written, except for when the book tells you that they're speaking a different language. But either way, the book goes with the second option, serious English, non-English smatterings, but not just made-up alien words, and this is where some of the real depth of the world that Herbert's created comes in. Soon after I started reading the book, very soon, as I'll tell you in a minute, I was already puzzling over a lot of words that are this book's equivalent of the alien language, but there was something about them. They were very convincing. Either they'd just been very carefully thought up, or they derived from actual real words. So I looked it up. Now, you wouldn't know it to look at me, but I don't have any education in Arabic or Persian, which explains why I didn't recognise a lot of the words, because that's where most of them seem to come from. A choice was then before me. I could sit there and read the wikis and research into the world and the language of Dune, but this book came out in the 60s, and lots of people as white as me have been reading it for decades before it was easy to Google and look up the origins of all these phrases. So I decided to plough on in my ignorance and read the book blind, and let it teach me these terms and let them be things from Dune for a while, and then after I'd finished reading the book, then I would go and do the research. Which I still haven't done. So, pretending that little Google voyage had never set sail and that I was completely ignorant to the origins of the language in the book, what we find in the opening paragraph is a pretty confusing trip through the language of the world of Dune. Straight away in the second sentence we have Bene Gesserit. I say Gesserit only because I've seen the film again since. I went through the whole book thinking it was Gesserit. And maybe it is! In sentence 3 we've got Muad'Dib and Padishah, and finally the still slightly confusing, even after having read the entire book, Arrakis, the planet known as Dune. Is it known as Dune though? I mean, they just call it Arrakis all the way through this. Maybe they say Dune 4, 5, 6 times, but usually in the context of Arrakis, the planet known as Dune. Anyway, first thing that happens is a wise old woman shows up and starts spurting out buzzwords. Now, we've established that these words aren't just made up, but if he's going to start using them in the same way that people who have made up alien languages do, then it's likely to start putting me off, and this very first scene threatened to do that. If he's really the Kwisatz Haderach, she says, about 5 paragraphs into the book, and quickly follows it up with, "Tomorrow you'll need all your faculties to meet my Gom Jabbar." And as I say, I've read a lot of books that carry on like this, and it usually comes off as kind of teasing, like the writer's teasing you that you don't know enough about this book yet. This will all make sense in the future when you're a fan. I'm not going to be a fan later unless you start making sense soon, am I? Because I'll have closed the book, won't I? And this is why Dune, even though it skirts close to this, comes as a really pleasant surprise. Secondly, because it turns out all the language is real. But I couldn't know that while I was reading the book, so let's go back to firstly, because the next thing that happens in the book is that the hero, who, in a world of Litos and Thufirs and Gurneys and Fade Routhers, is just called Paul, lies awake in bed and says, "I don't know what any of those words meant, I hope I find out soon." And there's suddenly this great sense of relief. Oh, good, I'm not being teased for not understanding these words, I'm actually going to be told what they mean, and I was. I came out at the end of the book knowing loads about the world of Dune without any of it having felt baffling at all beyond those first few pages. And that comes as a really pleasant surprise because having rewatched the film after reading the book, I wasn't wrong about the film. The film simply doesn't explain at any point any of what it's wittering on about, and it actively employs that technique I was just complaining about, where it uses the big buzzwords in order to try and sound clever. It's the kind of film that just points the camera right in the face of one of the characters and has them recite the buzzwords in a kind of monotone. It's so obnoxious, but not so the book. The book has a lot of stuff in it that could have been confusing, but it's presented in a really understandable way. So, next reason I probably ought to dislike this book, but for some reason didn't, is the planet of Dune itself. You probably know this already, but Dune is a desert planet. It's called Arrakis, but it's known as Dune, and its conditions are harsher than deserts here on Earth. Probably, I haven't done the research. But that's it, it's not a space desert, it's not a sci-fi desert particularly, it's just a really unpleasant desert. The one sci-fi element in it really is the giant sandworms, and that's sci-fi in the purest sense, you know, in the scientifically this could happen if the conditions were right sense, as opposed to sci-fi in the blue lights and teleporters way. Is it alright? Am I supposed to say SF instead of sci-fi? I think that's what you're supposed to do, isn't it? Sorry to any science fiction fans who really feel strongly one way or the other, I don't know the rules. So anyway, other than the worms, you're just in a big desert. Well, a weakness that I have as a reader, which I don't think I was aware of until I read Robert Reed's Marrow, is that I find it hard to read stories about people living in extremely difficult to survive conditions. I don't mean when they're in danger as part of the story. I don't mean, you know, peril. That's exciting, and you know, you have a certain amount of it in the right places in a story, and I think books like this are written with that idea in mind. If the planet you're living on wants to kill you, and you have to spend your every waking moment and, you know, really most of your sleeping moments just trying to survive, then that means that you're in peril all the time, and that should mean a really exciting read, because, you know, it's the peril all the time. But to me, it isn't. To me, reading about a grueling life is itself grueling. As I say, I know this is a weakness that I have as a reader, but that's the way it is. I'm one of those people who holds their breath while a character in a film is trapped underwater to see if I could last as long as they do. This book opens on scenes of essentially royal life on a technologically advanced planet. So to be suddenly taken from that and then dumped into this inhospitable desert world, this punishing desert planet, it kind of feels like having your sci-fi epic taken away and replaced with something that threatens to be a tedious trek across a punishing world where you can forget about cool future tech and space travel and all that silly schoolboy stuff that there's no point in pretending I'm not secretly hoping for when I crack open a new big sci-fi book. No, here, the most precious thing is water, and that's because there's none, and you are using it up with every drop you imbibe, and that's so stressful to me. I mean, yeah, it is interesting to see how the local people have adapted to this, and how they store up their sweat and learn never to cry, but it's not enjoyable for me to read about. It's just really, really stressful. It just makes me want to drink all the time. I'm gonna have a drink now, even just thinking about it. Ugh. See, we're lucky. Look at all this water we've got all over the place. Oh. But the funny thing is, again, the book didn't stop me this time. I don't think it overplayed the stressful aspect. I think Herbert took the stress and dangled it in front of me just long enough and just enough times that it made me feel as if it was always there. But then he would pull it away, just in time, every time, to introduce a new interesting idea or character, so that I was left with the feeling of it, but actually I wasn't having to slog through it. I said interesting characters. I'll mention the characters in a minute. Some of them are interesting, some of them not really up to much, but they're not interchangeable robo-people like in some books I've read. But first, another one of my pet peeves that I've seen crop up in a few different fantasy and sci-fi books, and usually it's so tedious and long that I'm just climbing the walls by the end of it waiting for it to be over. And it's here in full force in this book, and for all I know, maybe this is where the trope comes from in the first place. This is the part where the hero joins a simple tribe and learns that their primitive ways are perhaps not so primitive after all. And of course now you're asking me what books this turns up in, and I'm drawing a blank. The only one I can think of is Wizard's First Rule. But I've seen it a few times. It pivots around the endlessly frustrating trope of you don't understand our customs, and we're not going to tell you what they are, but you have to do them anyway. And meanwhile, the stranger doesn't ask what their customs are either. He just gets all super confident and tries to bluster his way through. Why did anyone ever come up with this? Why is it so ubiquitous? It can't be any more fun to write than it is to read. But once again, I didn't mind it here. I think my least favourite parts of the book were the our customs bits. But at least the customs were grounded in something. You could tell where they come from and why they started. And wherever you couldn't quite see the roots of a custom that they had, you could see the historical soil that they were growing in. There were still some bits I found frustrating here. There were bits where Paul would find himself in a situation where he had to just guess at what the appropriate response to their social cues was. It's always frustrating to me in these bits to have the hero just guess what to do, and then it's a great relief when he gets it right and isn't executed. And everyone laughs and pats him on the back. Ha ha ha! And yes, this book contains the old chestnut of, now you've done this thing you couldn't possibly have known was a custom that we have, you've now proposed to my daughter. But luckily, it's actually handled really nicely, and is actually quite a good bit. And that's the difference! Aside from a couple of bits, this section isn't about butting heads with people who are set in their unfathomable old rituals, and it's more about learning why these environments would lead to rituals and customs like these, and you do come out with a happy understanding of how it all fits together and works. I don't think back over the book and wish that that bit hadn't been in it, which I do for some other examples of this same trope, mud people. Okay, characters. Well, Paul, he's a bit of a blank slate. Most of what he does seems to be driven by the unspecific prophecy he's destined to fulfill, and he generally just manages to go around happening to do things that happen to be in the prophecy while being all super serious. But some of the other characters are pretty interesting. There's a soldier bard called Gurney Halleck, and my brain, without any conscious thought, without me deciding this, my brain just cast Ian Glenn as Gurney Halleck while I was reading it. And that's interesting because while you probably know Ian Glenn as Jorah from Game of Thrones, I hadn't watched Game of Thrones and I didn't really know him from anything at the time. No idea what I'd seen him in or why he came to mind. It was just that was what the character looked like in my head. And now that I've caught up with Game of Thrones, which I've been doing over the last few weeks, I'm convinced I was right to cast him as Gurney. It works. So there you are. If anyone's thinking of remaking Dune for TV or film anytime soon, Ian Glenn as Gurney Halleck. And then there's poor old Chani or whatever her name is, whose first act in the book is to essentially overpower the Chosen One, and who then just steps obediently back and sits down on her supporting character chair. From then on, her purpose is just to sort of worry and be told what she's going to do with her life. I think I'll avoid spoilers, even though Dune is old, because honestly, who came up with the it's not a spoiler if it's old idea anyway? Presumably someone who constantly bankrupts himself by watching, reading and playing every piece of media the day it comes out, and screw that guy. So I'll be vague about the bit at the end where Chani is told that something is going to be happening, which I found unreasonable. Well, not unreasonable, the book gives you the reasons and it explains everything, but it's just not very nice. Anyway, I think we're supposed to look at her a bit through the lens of the way that we've been looking at Paul's mother, Jessica. Jessica's pretty interesting, and a few of the book's more interesting bits happen around or because of or in her. She's one of those characters who's been trained to deal and cope really well with extreme circumstances. Well look, it's difficult for me to talk about her really, because I seem to be able to think of exceptions to everything I might say, and I don't know what that says about what. But anyway, then there's Baron Harkonnen, who is a lot more interesting than he is in the film, in which he's just like, I'm very nasty. He's got some characters around him, but honestly I can't be bothered talking about them. Read the book, they're in it. Let's do one more character, the Spice. Yeah, it's not a character, but I'm mentioning it because it's one of the big things in Dune that everyone knows about and that's really important. Before I read the book, I knew that the Spice was the big deal thing in the book, but I didn't have much of an idea what it is or does. After reading the book, I'm quite interested in the way that it's treated. Herbert doesn't really spend a lot of time telling you what it does. He certainly doesn't feel obliged to explain at length how it does it. You hear early on that it's involved in space travel, but that's kind of all you need. It doesn't really matter what the spice is specifically. This book is about the people and the ways of life that circle around it. And the book tells you about the rigmarole of getting it and protecting ownership of it and the means of getting it. If there was special stuff in the sand, Herbert says, this is, in great and intricate detail, what would happen around that. Here are the cultures that would spring up, and here's the technology they'd need to collect it and sell it and to survive around it. These are the people who would surround it, and these are the differences between their cultures, and here are the clashes and squabbles and the wars that they would get involved in. Yeah, I am going to end up reading more of these books, aren't I? I am. It's all really interesting. So as I say, I'm trying to steer around actual spoilers, and because of that, it's going to be tricky for me to mention something that I've got to mention that happens at the end and really knock me for a loop. But it needs mentioning, and so I'm going to mention it as a sort of general topic without telling you how exactly it pertains to the story. So I won't tell you how it's used, but if you're a real stickler for avoiding spoilers, then when I've finished talking about it, I'll do this. So if you mute the sound now, and then unmute me again when you see me do that. Okay? Okay, so I'm talking about the fact that you get to the end of the book and suddenly they start selling women to each other. And not just background faceless concubine characters or anything, I'm talking about like main characters that we've come to know about as a way of brokering deals between like main characters, and it's meant to not seem odd, I think. You know, it's written in a way like, well, this is what happens when powerful men make deals with each other. And this affects one of our main characters, and then the guy mansplains to her that it's all fine, and that's the end. Are we supposed to feel disappointed with that moment? Is it a twist where the mood is supposed to nosedive? It felt like it was written to be acceptable, and I was just being all, you know, modern about it. But you have one of the main characters actively upset about this, and then it just happens anyway, and no one does anything about it. And this is where I think we're supposed to think back to Jessica and how she starts off as a concubine to a powerful man, but a concubine who is loved, a wife in all but title. And I think we're meant to accept that that's fine, and that it'll all be fine. I don't know. Maybe that's the source of drama in the sequels. I don't know. So it isn't perfect, and it isn't usually the kind of book that I tend to respond to, but as I was writing down notes for this video, I found myself really missing it. I was looking at the book hungrily, wanting to dive in, and whenever I did, you know, look up something to reference something, I found myself just wanting to keep reading the passages that I'd opened on. And this happened while I was reading it as well. There's something moreish about this book. There were a couple of bits where I was drifting a bit and wondering about reading something else, but you have to understand that in all but my favourite books, I often get very strongly drawn away somewhere around the midpoint. I usually really want to abandon a book in order to read whatever the next thing I'm excited about is. And I often do, unless the book's really gripping me. Well, in this book, I read it all the way to the end without reading anything else in between, and that's got to mean something. So if you're in the position I was in, where the fact that you haven't read Dune yet is a bit of a weight on your mind, do go ahead and read it. I don't think you'll regret it, and you might end up as one of those people who really love it. I like it. I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I have it as part of the wallpaper of my brain now. So the question is, will I read any more of it? I don't know at this point. There are a lot of Dune books, at least 6 of which come recommended by Dune fans, and I know they're Dune fans, so they would recommend it. That sounds redundant, doesn't it? But remember, we should know by now, after all these years of internet we have behind us, that fans are the one group least likely to like the thing they're fans of. So to me, it does stand for something that I've heard that the actual Frank Herbert written books are worth reading. And who knows, maybe the others are great as well, and the fans who complained about it were just being complainy fans like fans are. Perhaps I shall find out, but not straight away. I know what the next couple of books I'm going to be reading are, so I will talk to you about them, I guess, once I've read them. So, thank you for joining me in the book corner again, and we'll talk about a different book at a different time than this. Bye! May the spice... something.